Ladies and gentlemen, life is suffering. That is not a pessimistic statement. It is a truthful one. The world is not a safe place, and you are not guaranteed a peaceful existence. You will encounter tragedy, betrayal, pain, and perhaps worse, apathy. And when the darkness descends, it is very easy, far too easy, to conclude that you are alone, that your suffering is meaningless, that no one sees, that no one cares. Life is suffering. This is not merely a philosophical assertion. It is an observation rooted in reality. From the moment we become conscious, we are confronted with limitation, with failure, with loss. People we love die. Dreams we nurture collapse. Plans go awry. Even the most privileged are not exempt. Suffering is a universal condition. You cannot escape it by wealth, by intelligence, or by status. And to pretend otherwise is to enter into a dangerous illusion that will eventually be shattered by reality itself. Now, why start here? Because unless you acknowledge the reality of suffering, you cannot confront it. You cannot overcome what you refuse to name. Much of the despair in the modern world comes not from suffering itself, but from the mistaken belief that it should not exist. We are told, often subtly, sometimes explicitly, that life should be happy, smooth, and uninterrupted, that suffering is a glitch, an error in the system, something to be corrected. And so when hardship inevitably arrives, it feels like betrayal, it feels unjust. But it's not unjust, it's intrinsic. When you begin with the recognition that life is suffering, something paradoxical happens, clarity. You are no longer confused when pain arises. You are no longer deceived into thinking that something has gone terribly wrong. Instead, you realize that pain is part of the structure of existence, that it is baked into the very framework of being human. This does not mean we seek suffering, but it means we stop running from it, we stop denying it, and only then can we begin to engage with it seriously, constructively, and meaningfully. But here's the deeper point. Suffering is not just unavoidable, it is essential. It is the crucible through which character is formed. Without it, we do not grow, we do not mature, we do not become resilient. Consider the strongest, wisest people you know. Are they people who have avoided pain, or are they people who have endured it, who have faced it, wrestled with it, and come out the other side changed? There is a deep, undeniable link between the weight a person carries and the strength they display, and this introduces a key insight. Suffering is not only real, it can be meaningful. It can serve a purpose. It can produce wisdom, compassion, endurance, and even joy, not the superficial joy of momentary pleasure, but the deep joy that comes from knowing that you have confronted the abyss and prevailed. Meaning does not emerge despite suffering often, it emerges through it. That's why many of the great traditions speak of suffering not as a punishment, but as a path, a narrow, difficult road that refines the soul. Yet in modern life, we are conditioned to anesthetize our pain, to scroll it away, to drink it away, to distract ourselves into numbness. But when we do that, we rob ourselves of the very process that could elevate us. Suffering is not the enemy. Avoidance is. Escape is. Denial is. Because those things preserve the illusion of comfort at the cost of real transformation. If you can truly accept that life is suffering, then you are free, not from pain. From surprise, you stop asking, why me? And begin asking, what now? You stop assuming that hardship is a mistake and start treating it as a summons. This shift in mindset is radical, and it is necessary, because the person who understands that suffering is part of life is not broken by it. They are prepared for it. And in that preparation lies power, real, enduring, unshakable power. God works through hardship, not around it. This is a difficult truth to accept, especially in a culture that associates divine favor with ease, comfort, and unbroken success. Many people imagine that if God is truly on their side, then life should be smooth. Problems should dissolve and pain should be rare. But that is not the pattern found in the deep stories of faith, nor is it the pattern observed in the lives of the people who grow into strength, wisdom, and character. In fact, the very evidence that God is working may be found in the fact that hardship exists, not as a sign of neglect, but as a mark of attention, not as abandonment, but as engagement. When you look at the great narratives passed down through human history, whether from scripture, mythology, or literature, the central figures do not escape suffering. They walk straight into it. They are tested, stretched, humbled, and often broken before they are transformed. Moses wanders for years in the wilderness before he leads. Joseph is betrayed and imprisoned before he is exalted. David faces lions, giants, and exile before he wears the crown. Even Christ himself is not spared suffering. He endures it to the point of death. This is not coincidental. This is instructional. Hardship is the method. It is the classroom, the forge, the sacred space in which the human soul is refined. It's tempting to believe that God's work should look like intervention, removing obstacles, shielding us from harm, fixing what's broken before we ever feel the damage. But that belief infantilizes us. It assumes that the highest good is to be comfortable rather than to be strong. And this is precisely where the misunderstanding lies. God's aim is not your comfort, it's your transformation. He is far more interested in who you are becoming than in how easy your journey feels. That is a confronting idea, especially for those who want their spiritual lives to insulate them from reality rather than prepare them for it. The furnace of hardship is not cruel when it has purpose. Pain becomes bearable when it is known to be part of a larger design. When you realize that your struggle may not be senseless, you begin to see patterns where you once saw only chaos. You begin to suspect that the storm is doing more than tearing things apart. It may be clearing ground for something better to grow. God does not waste suffering. He weaves it. He threads it through the story in a way that often only becomes visible in hindsight. But you cannot see the pattern if you are convinced that hardship is always a sign of absence. Some of the most profound moments of divine work are those that happen in silence, in the waiting, in the tension, in the unanswered prayers, and the delayed outcomes. These are the places where faith matures, where trust deepens, not trust in outcomes, but trust in presence. You begin to realize that God is not working in spite of the hardship. He is working precisely through it. He is shaping your patience in the delay, your resilience in the failure, your humility in the loss. He is pressing strength into your soul through the very things you would never have chosen for yourself. If we believe that the Creator is intelligent, intentional, and moral, then it stands to reason that his methods, even the painful ones, are not random, they are exact, tailored. Not one moment of hardship is wasted in the hands of one who knows how to turn ashes into beauty. But that means you must stop interpreting pain as divine punishment. It may be divine preparation. You must stop assuming that difficulty means something has gone wrong. It may mean that something is being made right deep inside of you. Growth requires responsibility and sacrifice. This is not a comforting idea, but it is a necessary one. We live in a world that often confuses growth with expansion, more success, more recognition, more freedom, more pleasure. But real growth, the kind that forms the foundation of a meaningful life, comes at a cost. It demands the voluntary acceptance of responsibility and the willingness to give something up in order to become something more. You cannot evolve into your highest potential without first shouldering the burden of becoming accountable for your existence. Responsibility is the path to maturity. It is what divides the child from the adult, not in age, but in posture toward life. A child says, "It's not my fault," while a responsible person says, "Even if it isn't my fault, it's still my responsibility." That shift in mindset is the beginning of growth. Because when you take responsibility, you stop waiting for someone else to change your life. You stop blaming the world for its unfairness. You stop resenting others for what you lack. You step into agency. You become the person who acts, not just the one who reacts. And that step is transformative because it puts you in direct relationship with both your potential and your limitations. But responsibility is not easy. It is heavy. It comes with constraints, demands, and the inevitability of failure. And that is precisely why it leads to growth. When you commit to a goal, when you accept a burden, when you voluntarily choose to carry something meaningful, you are stretched beyond your comfort. You face parts of yourself you didn't know existed. You encounter resistance, both internal and external. And it is through wrestling with that resistance that you become stronger. Responsibility is like weightlifting for the soul. You don't grow by avoiding it. You grow by engaging with it consistently, even when it's painful. Then comes sacrifice. Growth doesn't just require effort. It requires the surrender of something valuable: time, comfort, safety, ego, and often the illusion of control. You cannot stay the same and also become who you are meant to be. Something has to die for something greater to live. This is a deep truth found in every spiritual tradition, every great story, and every psychological breakthrough. And you must let go. To move forward, you must leave something behind. And what you leave behind is often the very thing you cling to the most: your fears, your excuses, your self-image, or your comfortable dysfunctions. Sacrifice is sacred precisely because it is difficult. It is the moment when you declare that the future is more important than the present. That meaning is more valuable than pleasure. That becoming who you ought to be matters more than staying who you are. And when you sacrifice rightly, not out of guilt or compulsion, but out of vision and purpose, you align yourself with something much larger than yourself. You participate in a moral structure of reality where effort is not wasted, where struggle is not meaningless, and where the hard road leads somewhere worth going. The most dangerous lie we can believe is that we can have transformation without cost, that we can grow without struggle, that we can become more without giving up what we were. This lie keeps people stagnant. It keeps them passive, waiting for change to happen to them instead of through them. But change that happens to you can crush you. Change that happens through you shapes you. And the difference lies in whether or not you are willing to take responsibility and make the necessary sacrifices. There is something deeply noble in the act of carrying your load and choosing to give up short-term comfort for long-term integrity. It is not flashy, it is not easy, but it is real. And it is in that reality that genuine growth begins. Pain is a tool for transformation, not punishment. This idea challenges the instinctive reaction most people have when they encounter suffering. The natural question that arises in the face of pain is, what did I do to deserve this? Embedded in that question is the assumption that pain is always a form of retribution. That hardship means you've done something wrong and are being punished for it. But this is not always the case. In fact, the very opposite is true. Pain, rather than signaling moral failure or divine displeasure, can be the precise instrument that shapes you into who you are meant to be. Pain gets your attention. It interrupts the momentum of complacency and forces you to stop, to examine, to feel. We live in a world where distraction is easy and comfort is marketed as the ultimate goal. In that environment, it becomes dangerously simple to avoid the deeper questions of life. But pain strips away the distractions. It collapses the illusions. It pushes you into a confrontation with yourself. You cannot hide from real pain. It finds you, it demands your presence. And in doing so, it opens a door to insight that no amount of comfort can offer. Pain teaches. It exposes weakness. It reveals where you are vulnerable, where you've been lying to yourself, where your foundation is cracked. That exposure is not meant to humiliate or destroy you. It is meant to prepare you. Because unless you see clearly what is broken, you cannot begin to rebuild it. Unless you know what hurts, you cannot heal. Pain is diagnostic. It is the body's way of signaling injury and the soul's way of signaling growth. But in order to benefit from it, you must stop seeing it as the enemy. You must recognize it as a messenger, even if it speaks in a harsh voice. Transformation rarely happens in the absence of pain. Growth involves change, and change involves letting go of what was. This process can be deeply uncomfortable. There is a reason why people often resist transformation. It costs something. It costs the familiar, the known, the secure. Pain is the evidence that you are moving through the threshold of you were into the unknown territory of who you are becoming. And like all rites of passage, it tests your resolve. It strips you down to your essentials. It asks whether you are serious about becoming more than what you've been. Pain builds empathy. When you have suffered deeply, you begin to understand others in a way that you could not before. You begin to see their words, not just their words. You begin to connect, not from a place of superiority, but from shared humanity. This is one of the most redemptive aspects of pain. It has the potential to expand your heart, to create compassion where there was judgment, to develop humility where there was pride. Pain breaks you open, but in that breaking, something new can be planted, something softer, wiser, and more real. There is a refining quality to pain that cannot be replicated by comfort. When everything is going well, it's easy to drift easy to lose focus, to compromise, to settle into routines that no longer serve you. But pain calls you back to, it forces truth. It strips away the unnecessary and reveals what truly matters. In that sense, pain doesn't just change what you do, it changes what you value. And when your values change, your direction changes. You begin to seek meaning rather than escape. You begin to choose purpose over ease. You begin to live differently, not because someone told you to, but because the pain reshaped your internal world. Pain, then, is not simply something to be endured or avoided. It is something to be listened to, learned from, and integrated. It has the power to turn arrogance into humility, distraction into focus, weakness into strength. The key is not to avoid pain at all costs, but to engage with it honestly, to allow it to do its work, to let it carve away what is false and bring forward what is true. You are not alone. Divine order is at work. In moments of despair, it is tempting to believe that existence is cold, random, and indifferent to your suffering. When things fall apart, when you lose someone you love, when plans unravel, and when everything you hope for collapses into dust, the silence can feel overwhelming. It can lead you to assume that no one sees, that no one cares, and worst of all, that your pain has no meaning. But this conclusion is not just mistaken, it is incomplete. Because even in the silence, even in the chaos, there is movement. There is structure. There is purpose beyond what you can see. You are not abandoned in a pit of randomness. You are within a design that is deeper than your immediate understanding. No, this idea requires a kind of faith, not blind optimism, but a willingness to trust that the apparent disorder of your life may conceal a hidden order. It is the same kind of trust that allows you to plant a seed in the earth without seeing the roots take hold. You don't need to see the process for it to be real. Much of what governs growth is invisible, subtle, slow, and often quiet. The same is true for divine activity. It's not always loud. It is not always dramatic, but it is real. And it is present even when it feels absent. There is a long-standing pattern across spiritual traditions that suggests the divine often hides itself during moments of transformation. In the wilderness, in the dark night of the soul, in the pit before the rise, these are the places where God seems most silent, and yet paradoxically, where the most profound shifts are taking place. The silence is not proof of absence. It may be the space required for something new to take root. If everything were made visible and obvious, you would never need to develop trust, patience, or endurance. And those are not small things. They are pillars of a meaningful life. There is a structure to your story, even if you can't see the blueprint. The challenges you face, the detours you take, the people who come and go, they are not necessarily accidents. Often they are the very tools being used to shape you into something stronger, deeper, more capable of carrying the weight of your purpose. When you begin to see your life this way, not as a series of disconnected events, but as part of a larger narrative, everything begins to shift. You stop interpreting delay as failure. You stop mistaking hardship for punishment. You begin to suspect that there is something sacred about your struggle. Believing that divine order is at work does not mean you stop feeling pain or doubt. It means you refuse to be ruled by them. It means that in your moments of confusion, you hold on to the possibility that something greater is unfolding. It means you trust that what feels like loss may in time be revealed as redirection. That what looks like rejection may be the protection you couldn't understand yet. That what seems like a dead end is actually a turn in the path, one you were always meant to take. This perspective is not easy. It requires humility because it forces you to admit that you don't know everything. It requires courage because you have to keep walking even when the way forward is unclear. And it requires a kind of disciplined hope, a refusal to let cynicism harden you, even when the world tries to convince you that nothing matters. But when you hold this hope, when you trust that divine order is at work behind the curtain, you begin to walk differently. You carry yourself with a quiet strength. You endure, not just because you have to, but because you sense that you are being guided, formed, and ultimately elevated through the very things you would never have chosen for yourself. Passive victimhood blocks divine progress. There is a very real temptation, especially in the face of adversity, to collapse into a mindset that says, this has happened to me, and there's nothing I can do about it. It is the posture of resignation, of waiting for rescue rather than engaging with responsibility. And while the pain that leads to this mindset is often genuine, born from trauma, failure, disappointment, or injustice, the mindset itself becomes a prison. It stops you from seeing that despite your suffering, you still have agency. You still have choices. And those choices matter more than your circumstances. To be a passive victim is to interpret life as a series of events that simply happen to you, stripping you of the belief that you can influence outcomes or respond with strength. This perspective might provide temporary relief. It allows you to avoid the burden of responsibility, but over time, it robs you of dignity. It denies the deeper truth that while you may not be responsible for what has happened to you, you are responsible for what you do next. That gap between what hurts and how you respond is the very space where growth, healing, and divine progress occur. If you surrender that space, you surrender the possibility of transformation. There is something fundamentally spiritual about rising to meet your suffering with action. It is not about denying pain, pretending it doesn't hurt, or forcing false positivity. It is about refusing to let pain dictate the terms of your life. It is about saying, yes, this happened, but I am not finished. I am not defined by the damage. I am defined by the way I choose to engage with it. This mindset is not only psychologically powerful, it is spiritually aligned with the way divine order moves through human lives. Because God does not typically impose change upon passive people. He works through movement, through decision, through the conscious effort to rise in the face of difficulty. The most powerful transformations come not when someone is rescued from pain, but when they meet it with courage and engage with it honestly. The divine does not seem to bypass the will of a person who has decided to give up. Instead, it flows through the one who, in weakness and confusion, still says, I will try. There's a reason the stories that inspire us most involve perseverance, determination, and grit. We are moved not by ease, but by the triumph of spirit over circumstance. And that triumph begins when victimhood is replaced by agency. That does not mean we ignore the realities of injustice or the ways others have caused harm. Acknowledging what has happened is part of healing. But there is a difference between acknowledgement and identity. When you make victimhood your identity, you close the door to possibility. You become tethered to the wound instead of to the future. Progress, divine or otherwise, requires openness. It requires a willingness to say, this is not how the story ends, even if you don't yet know how the next chapter begins. This is where faith intersects with discipline. You don't wait until you feel strong to reject victimhood. You start by acting as if your life still matters. You speak truth. You make a small change. You take a step forward, even if it's shaky. This is not about pretending you are unaffected. It's about refusing to let your pain be the final authority on your identity. When you act in this way, you send a signal to your mind, your body, and yes, perhaps even the divine, that you are willing to participate in your own restoration. That you are not merely an object of pity, but a person with purpose. The divine seems to honor movement. Not perfection, not complete clarity, but motion in the right direction. You do not need to have it all figured out to the begin, but you do need to let go of the belief that nothing is possible, because that belief is a kind of surrender, not to God, but to despair. And despair is not neutral, it is corrosive. It blocks progress, chokes vision, and silences the voice inside you that says, there is still something worth fighting for. Faith is not passive belief. It is active alignment. Too often, faith is misunderstood as mere mental assent, as if agreeing with a set of spiritual ideas is enough to change the trajectory of a person's life. But faith, in its truest and most vital form, is not just something you hold in your mind. It is something you embody. It is not an escape from reality. It is a confrontation with it. To have faith is to choose daily to align your behavior, your thoughts, and your choices with something greater than what your immediate circumstances might suggest. This kind of faith is not comfortable. It demands effort, intention, and an ongoing willingness to act even when you cannot see the full picture. When things go wrong, when outcomes are delayed, when prayers seem unanswered, faith doesn't simply sit still and wait. It moves, it builds, it obeys what is right, even in the face of uncertainty. That is what makes it powerful. It becomes a dynamic force that shapes how you live rather than a static idea you agree with during quiet moments. It is expressed through perseverance, through sacrifice, through the refusal to collapse in the face of adversity. Faith is not naive optimism. It does not say, everything will be fine, and then proceed to do nothing. Faith looks at the brokenness and still chooses to build. It looks at the confusion and still decides to trust. It sees the limitations, the failures, the setbacks, and it continues to act in alignment with what is good, what is right, and what is ultimately redemptive. This is not wishful thinking. It is disciplined hope. It is the deliberate refusal to be controlled by fear, despair, or apathy. That refusal is not born from arrogance, but from the deep awareness that something meaningful can be brought forth from even the most difficult circumstances if you are willing to engage. There is a kind of spiritual maturity that arises only when faith becomes action. This maturity doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from showing up when you feel broken, from doing the right thing when no one is watching, from building something honest in a world full of shortcuts and deception. This is the work of faith, not just believing in the unseen, but living as though it is real. That kind of life demands courage. It asks you to make choices that cost something. It often puts you at odds with convenience, with culture, even with parts of yourself that want to take the easier path. Faith also requires consistency. One act of belief is not enough to carry you through life. You must reinforce it through habits, through relationships, through discipline. You must feed it with truth, not fantasy. You must anchor it in principles that are deeper than emotion or opinion. Otherwise, it will collapse under pressure. And pressure always comes. Faith that is not practiced in the dark will not sustain you when the lights go out. That is why active alignment matters. It makes faith durable. It turns it into a living force that shapes how you respond when life becomes difficult. To align yourself with something greater does not mean you have control over outcomes. It means you have control over your posture. You choose to face the world with integrity. You choose to carry hope without certainty. You choose to love even when it's not returned. You build when it seems pointless. You forgive when it seems unfair. These choices are not made because they guarantee success. They are made because they align with what is true and right, and because aligning yourself with truth is itself a kind of success, one that no circumstance can take away. There is something profoundly transformative about living this way. It makes you dependable, it makes you strong, it makes you trustworthy. Not because you always win, but because you are rooted in something deeper than winning. You become someone who brings order into chaos, who brings light into dark spaces, not because life is easy, but because you have chosen to act in accordance with a higher pattern even when the world tempts you to abandon it. Hope is a discipline, not a feeling. That is a statement that cuts against much of what we are taught to believe about hope in popular culture. Hope is often treated as something passive, something that rises naturally when circumstances are favorable or when outcomes seem promising. But that kind of hope is fragile. It breaks easily under pressure. It vanishes the moment disappointment enters the room. Real hope, the kind that sustains a person through tragedy, betrayal, uncertainty, and long seasons of waiting, is not built on good feelings. It is forged through choice, deliberate, repeated, sometimes painful choice. To treat hope as a discipline is to understand that it must be practiced. It must be cultivated with intention. It is not simply the absence of despair, but the conscious decision to resist it. When everything around you feels like it's falling apart, when your prayers feel unanswered, when progress is slow or invisible, hope must be chosen. And that choice is often made in silence, in solitude. In the private interior world where no one else sees the fight, you wake up and choose to believe that meaning still exists. You choose to act as though your life matters. You choose to contribute, to build, to care, even when you don't feel like it. This is not the same thing as denial. Hope is not pretending everything is okay when it isn't. It's not painting over suffering with cheap optimism. It's the refusal to let suffering be the final word. It's the defiance of despair. It is strength under pressure, not ignorance of the pressure itself. Hope sees clearly what is broken, but insists on the possibility of repair. It knows the statistics, but still chooses to believe in change. It knows the weight of grief, but still decides to live with open hands. This kind of hope is active. It engages. It takes responsibility for its own presence in the world. Disciplining yourself to hope means resisting the inertia of cynicism. Cynicism feels intelligent. It feels safe. It gives you the illusion of control because if you expect nothing, you can't be hurt. But cynicism is not wisdom. It's self-protection dressed up as insight. And over time, it shrinks your capacity to connect, to risk, to believe in the possibility of renewal. Hope challenges that. It says risk again, love again, build again, even though it might fall apart. Even though you've been disappointed before, even though the outcome is uncertain. That's what makes hope a discipline. It requires internal strength, repetition, and courage. Hope is also intimately tied to vision. You cannot sustain hope without a picture of what could be. It doesn't have to be a grand or detailed vision, but you need something to aim at, something worth striving for, something that anchors your actions beyond immediate gratification. This might be a restored relationship, a healed body, a redeemed community, or simply the belief that your suffering will not be wasted. Without vision, hope collapses into wishful thinking. With vision, hope becomes a kind of fuel, one that burns slowly but steadily, especially when all other sources of energy have dried up. It also matters where you place your hope. If your hope is rooted in circumstances, it will rise and fall with them. If it's placed in people, it will inevitably be shaken. But if hope is grounded in something deeper, something unshakable, something transcendent, it becomes remarkably resilient. It becomes a kind of quiet strength that holds you upright in the middle of storms. That is why hope, rightly practiced, becomes a source of moral clarity and emotional endurance. It gives you a framework for how to suffer well, how to endure setbacks, and how to remain faithful in the face of uncertainty. To treat hope as a discipline means you do not wait for the feeling to come to you. You create the conditions where it can live. You read what inspires. You speak words that build. You reject narratives that diminish your future. You surround yourself with people who carry light. And you take action, small, imperfect, sometimes faltering steps that move you towards something better, not because it's guaranteed, but because the act of moving is itself a declaration of hope. And that declaration, repeated over time, begins to form a person who is not simply reacting to the world, but helping shape it in the image of what is possible. In the grand tapestry of life, the struggles you face are not random nor meaningless. They are threads woven with purpose, working together to shape you into a stronger, wiser, and more resilient person. When you recognize that God is working on your behalf, even in the darkest moments, you reclaim your power to engage with pain, to resist passivity, and to move forward with faith and hope as your guides. This divine partnership calls you to rise beyond victimhood, to embody faith through action, and to discipline yourself in hope. It invites you to trust in a greater order at work behind the scenes, a force that transforms hardship into growth, silence into meaning, and despair into possibility. When you embrace this truth, you do not simply endure life, you become a co-creator of your future, shaped and sustained by a purpose far larger than yourself.